I was mid-sentence when I heard the words that ended everything. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. It was so quiet in that boardroom, you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. A vendor legal team sat across from us. Their lead counsel literally froze with her pen poised over a contract termination addendum I'd written myself. I didn't blink. I didn't ask them to repeat it. I simply let the words hang there in that cold, conditioned air while the HR director's voice trailed off into an embarrassed cough. That's the thing about corporate betrayal. It rarely screams. It whispers. My name is Evan Barrett. I was 38 years old at the time, Senior Vendor Compliance Manager at Falcon Dynamics. My entire role was designed around risk mitigation, finding vendor fraud, negotiating terminations, and protecting the company's reputation. Ironically, that's exactly what got me fired, because we were there that day to kill a $40 million vendor relationship, and they couldn't afford for me to finish the sentence that would have cost them everything. I'd spent 8 months preparing the termination file, line-by-line documentation of non-performance, screenshots of falsified QA sign-offs, cross-checks from internal audit trails, a contract clause so clean even the vendor's lawyers couldn't argue it, termination for cause with zero payout. It was beautiful work, and that was the problem. They didn't want the vendor gone. They wanted leverage. They wanted to waive the threat in negotiations, force new payment terms, and keep the kickbacks flowing quietly into departmental discretionary budgets. Have you ever watched your own work weaponized against you? I knew that day was coming. You don't spend 5 years in compliance without reading the room. I'd seen the meeting invites that didn't include me, the Slack channels I'd been quietly removed from, the director of procurement forgetting to share the vendor responses so I couldn't counter them before exec review. I'd had to fight just to get that meeting on the calendar, and now HR was here to make sure I didn't get to finish it. I paused just long enough for the vendor rep to shift uncomfortably in her seat, eyes darting between me and the HR director. I imagined she was wondering if she should still sign the settlement we'd spent weeks drafting. I imagined she was calculating what a sudden change in negotiation leads might mean for her commission. I didn't say a word. Why is this detail important? Because in vendor negotiations, hesitation is blood in the water, and they'd just made me bleed on purpose. The HR director cleared her throat and read the phrase again softer this time. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Please step away from the table. I looked at the vendor team, then at my own company's executive team. No one would meet my eyes. It was a clean kill, or they thought it was, because I'd spent 8 months preparing the termination case, but 3 months preparing for my own. In my bag sat a printed copy of our vendor termination file with the audit trail metadata intact. On my personal cloud, I'd archived every edit timestamp, every approval chain, every internal Slack message that showed who had ordered me to build it. And in my contract sat a non-compete clause with a loophole I'd found the first week I joined Falcon, a clause that only applied to voluntary separations and involuntary layoffs, but not for-cause terminations initiated during active vendor negotiations. That was the thing they never understood about compliance. The clause is only a weapon if you know how to read it. I stood slowly gathering my folder. My fingers drummed once on the table. It sounded like a judge's gavel in that dead silent room. If you need clarification on the clause, I said evenly, I'm happy to explain it later. No one answered. It's hard to argue with the person who wrote the policy. I turned to leave. My eyes met the vendor counsel's for half a second. She wasn't looking at my company anymore. She was looking at me. I kept my face blank. That moment told me everything. If you've ever seen someone blindsided in front of clients, if you know that hush in the room when betrayal is served, cold, maybe hit subscribe. We're going to talk about it, but that wasn't even the real betrayal. They like to say corporate betrayal is a sudden thing, a meeting, a memo, a line in a termination letter. But the truth is, it starts long before anyone says the words. It started for me 6 months before they fired me in that vendor negotiation. Back then it was just little things, meetings rescheduled that no one bothered to tell me about, calls with the vendor that somehow happened without my calendar invite. I'd built the entire vendor oversight process myself. I knew their billing cycles, their SLA failures, every missed compliance checkpoint. I'd written the audit findings that would let us terminate the contract for cause and avoid paying out penalties. But then I noticed my access permissions changing. Suddenly I was view only on the central contract management folder. I couldn't make edits, just suggestions. My Slack channel notifications went silent. I messaged the procurement director about it. He said there was a permissions update for security from whom? It didn't take a genius to figure it out. I'd see side conversations happening in our open plan office. My boss would lower his voice whenever I walked by. Other times he'd smile and wave like nothing was wrong. HR was worse passive-aggressive check-ins about my work-life balance, asking if I felt supported in my role. I didn't say much in those meetings, just nodded, took notes in my head, because the first rule of compliance is simple: always keep your own audit trail. So I did. Screenshots of access changes, email timestamps when I was removed from threads, PDF versions of the original vendor terminations and file with my name and the properties. I wasn't planning on fighting them in the open. That's not how you win in corporate America. I was planning to make sure when they pulled the trigger, it blew up in their face. Why does this matter? Because in vendor management, your leverage is your information. If they can lock you out, they can control the narrative. Without me pushing back, they could negotiate sweetheart terms with the vendor while pretending they were enforcing compliance. They wanted my termination plan as a threat, not as a promise. So they sidelined me. Slowly enough, most people didn't even notice. A meeting I wasn't needed in. A call I wasn't invited to. By the time HR scheduled my performance review, they'd laid the groundwork so well, it looked like a normal reorg. But I'd been in that chair too long not to see it coming. The real moment of clarity came when I reread my own employment contract. I had drafted vendor compliance addenda for years, so I understood how legal language worked. That's when I saw it, the non-compete clause. It was boilerplate copied from an old template, but in the definition section, voluntary separation and involuntary layoff were covered. There was no mention of for-cause terminations happening during active negotiations with a vendor, a hole big enough to drive my exit plan through. They wrote the clause, I just read it. I realized then they were building a case to remove me without paying severance and to scare me off from competing, but their own legal laziness had left them vulnerable. It was all right there in black and white, so I began preparing, quietly, methodically. I leased a small office space in my name, opened a business account for consulting services, told no one. On weekends, I didn't go hiking or visit breweries. I reviewed contract law and vendor compliance best practices. I designed an onboarding checklist for the vendor's entire process, because if they wanted to fire me during a negotiation, I wasn't going to stop them. I was going to make them commit. I remember staring at my laptop one evening in that cramped sublease office reviewing the vendor's quarterly billing variance. I wasn't even angry anymore. Is it really betrayal if you can see it coming for months? I just felt resolved. They thought they were freezing me out, but they were just giving me time to build something they couldn't touch. That's what they didn't understand about people in compliance. We don't scream when we're cornered. We document, and in those months, I documented everything. I let them think I was defeated. I let them think they'd won. Because when the day came to fire me in that room, I wanted them to believe they had me right where they wanted. I wanted them confident. That was the whole point. Because you can't spring a trap if your target knows it's there. But I did know. I knew exactly what they were planning, and I let them. They didn't have to convince me to train my own replacement. That was the most elegant part of the whole plan. They framed it as mentorship, said they valued my experience, wanted me to help build the next generation of compliance leadership. So I smiled and agreed, because when someone is trying to replace you quietly, there's no better move than making sure you're the one who sets the lesson plan. They picked Julia fresh from grad school, hungry for recognition. She didn't know she was being used. I didn't hold it against her. She was good, smart, detail-oriented, eager to learn. I walked her through the vendor termination file line by line, showed her how to cross-reference contract terms with audit trail findings, explained how to verify SLA breaches with billing data. I made sure she understood it perfectly. Meanwhile, they cut me out of meetings, stopped CCing me on vendor responses. I watched them quietly shift my contract approvals to Julia, always with a polite note about giving her growth opportunities. They wanted her ready to step in the second they got rid of me. So I made sure she would be. Why? Because the better she understood my work, the harder it would be to bury it after I was gone. They thought mentoring her would weaken me. They didn't see that it guaranteed the audit trail would survive. I watched as she asked sharp questions about the non-compete clause. She was curious why our template didn't include certain triggers. I shrugged, told her to always read the definitions section carefully. She didn't realize I was warning her in plain sight. I even forwarded her emails with contract drafts, making sure those conversations were discoverable in compliance archives. Every time she thanked me for being patient, I nodded, because I wasn't just teaching her to do my job. I was making sure she'd remember who taught her. They wanted me erased. I taught them how to keep my signature on everything. At night, I saved copies of our Slack conversations, every edit suggestion she made, the approvals that still carried my name in the metadata. People think corporate betrayal is loud, but it's made of small, polite requests. Can you let Julia shadow the vendor, calm mind, stepping out so she can lead this review? Let's get your feedback, but have her present. I never argued. Not once, because resistance would have given them justification to push me out faster. Instead, I handed them the rope. I documented everything. They never asked why I was so agreeable. They were too busy congratulating themselves for being so strategic. Why is this important? Because corporate compliance is built on paper trails. They thought they were rewriting the story without me, but they forgot the system we'd built was designed to preserve evidence, not erase it. Every handoff, every approval, every permission change had a log. Julia didn't realize it, but she was co-signing my work. She was authenticating the entire vendor termination file with her own edits and questions. So, when the day came to remove me, it wouldn't matter what HR said. The file would still be there, intact. Do you know how hard it is to bury something in a company built on compliance? It's impossible, unless everyone agrees to look away. And not everyone would. Because even as they excluded me, people noticed. They asked why I wasn't in meetings, why my approvals were delayed, why a junior associate was suddenly leading a $40 million vendor review. I didn't gossip, didn't explain. Just told them Julia was smart, said she'd do great. Because letting them underestimate me was the plan. They thought they were controlling the exit, but I was controlling the record. I let them believe I was defeated, because it made them sloppy. And if you've ever been quietly replaced at work, or seen it happen to someone else, you know exactly what I mean. If you've ever watched someone be edged out while training their replacement, or lived through it yourself, drop a comment or share your story, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. I didn't resist. I helped them plan it. They didn't pull me into HR all at once. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they did it in stages. A casual check-in. A calendar invite labeled Career Goals. The room always felt too quiet when I walked in. They'd smile, thank me for coming, slide a printed agenda across the table. Soft words, polite threats. We just want to make sure you're supported. Let's talk about your future here. Some people have expressed concerns about your communication style. I nodded, made notes. That's how corporate assassinations work. You don't get shot, you get documented. They asked me to develop a performance plan. I obliged. I made it thorough. Every metric clearly defined. Every milestone realistic. They complimented it, said it showed great ownership. Then they moved the goalposts. They added new stretch objectives halfway through. They asked for weekly updates instead of bi-weekly. They gave Julia my so-called mentee partial sign-off authority over my vendor reviews, all under the banner of development. I didn't argue. Arguing would have made their job easier. It mattered because HR doesn't want you to resist. They want you emotional, defensive, easy to label, difficult. So I let them think they'd won. I played along in every meeting. Yes, I see that feedback. I can definitely work on that. Thanks for the transparency. Meanwhile, I copied every meeting invite into a private calendar. Every version of my performance plan I saved as a PDF with time-stamped file names. When they updated the language to sound more negative, I kept both drafts. In compliance, the story is only as good as the documentation. They didn't realize that by dragging me through their process, they were giving me all the evidence I'd ever need. I remember sitting in one meeting where HR told me they had noticed concerns about my alignment with company culture. I asked them to define alignment. They couldn't. They just smiled. Polite, empty. Politeness is just the professional way to sharpen a knife. They talked about collaboration, but what they meant was obedience. They said feedback, but what they meant was a warning. They never once mentioned the vendor. Not the $40 million contract I'd spent months preparing to terminate for cause. Not the audit trail I'd built with my own hands. Not the fact that the vendor had already missed 3 critical SLA benchmarks while they delayed approving the termination. They didn't want to talk about any of that, because it would make them complicit. They needed me gone before I forced their hand, and they needed it to look justified. I watched them dance around it. HR saying they were disappointed in my tone during calls, my boss nodding solemnly like he was so sad it had come to this. Julia staring at the table. She wasn't stupid. She knew what was happening. But she didn't stop it, and I didn't expect her to. Because in this game, everyone plays their part. I played mine too. I stayed calm. I documented everything. I let them make it look clean. They thought the threat was my voice in those meetings. They never understood the real threat was my silence. Have you ever realized you were the only person in the room who knew what the words really meant? I walked out of those meetings with a straight face. No anger, no tears. Anger is a liability in compliance. Documentation is power. So, I built my case as carefully as I'd built the vendor termination file. They wanted a paper trail. I gave them one. They just didn't know who it would protect. They thought I was unprepared. They never asked why I stopped resisting. They started acting like my absence was already a given. Meetings were scheduled without me. Emails went out with my name conspicuously missing from the CC line. The vendor review I'd spent months tightening was suddenly on hold for leadership discussion. Julia was running point on calls now. She tried to hide her discomfort, but she wasn't good at pretending yet. I saw her hesitate when procurement pushed back on SLA non-compliance. She glanced at me across the table, when silently asking for backup. That was intentional, because backing her up would have made it hers. So I sat quietly typing notes in my own document. I made sure every vendor deviation was logged, every excuse archived. I saved the Slack threads where procurement stalled approvals and refused to sign off on the termination letter. They thought I was checked out. They didn't notice I was archiving everything. They told Julia to make it collaborative, which really meant soften the compliance language. She tried. She removed phrases like for cause termination and breach of contract, replacing them with performance conversation. I watched her do it. Then I made sure the previous drafts with my language were save time, stamped unalterable. Because you can edit a Google Doc, but you can't erase version history. They forgot that. The vendor termination file was still mine. Procurement didn't want to trigger an actual termination. They wanted to use the threat to negotiate better rates. They said as much in a call I was accidentally invited to before they realized I was still on the distribution list. I didn't speak, I just listened. And I recorded the invite. Because in corporate compliance, leverage is built on who knows what when. Julia's tone in meetings changed over those weeks. She became apologetic with the vendor, promising they just needed more time to review. But the SLA clock kept ticking. 3 missed benchmarks. I kept the evidence in my personal folder. They told me to hand off the final review document. I did so with a smile. I left the compliance notes intact. Every SLA failure, every audit citation, every contractual clause for termination for cause. I even wrote an executive summary, so clear procurement wouldn't dare present it to the vendor as is without admitting they were stalling for negotiation. They wanted me to finish it so they could bury it. I made sure it was too complete to kill. Julia read it line by line in the review call. I watched her face fall as she realized how explicit it was. She glanced at our boss, who nodded curtly. They thanked me for my thoroughness. I just nodded back, because they thought they were setting me up to fail. But they were signing off on every word. Email approvals, Slack confirmations, document histories, all in the system, all under their credentials. It mattered because corporate betrayal doesn't work if the system itself remembers what they're trying to forget. Julia started avoiding me in the hallway. I didn't blame her. She knew. She realized she wasn't just learning from me. She was inheriting my mess, or what they thought was my mess. Really, it was my insurance policy. My exit plan wasn't loud. It was methodical. It wasn't confrontational. It was cooperative on the surface. Because resistance gives them a reason to shut you out faster. Compliance is about patience and about documentation. About letting people sign their own confessions and email threads they think no one will ever check. Have you ever watched someone realize too late that they built their own gallows? That's what those last weeks were. They thought I'd lost control. I was just giving them enough rope. They let me sit through my last week like a ghost. No one told me I was leaving. No one made it official. They just stopped asking me questions. Meetings went ahead without me. Julia ran the vendor calls, her voice shaking just enough to betray she wasn't ready. Procurement kept delaying final sign-off, hoping the vendor would get tired of pushing back. I watched them, and I finished the file. The vendor termination file had to be unassailable. Every SLA breach documented, every email chain linked, every approval log. They thought they were freezing me out. They didn't realize they were forcing me to finish my work in private. I double-checked the SLA failure logs. 3 missed benchmarks in 90 days. Clause 7.3 of the contract termination for cause. Julia asked me to review her final draft. She tried to soften it, removed language about breach, added suggestions like collaborative renegotiation. I asked her if she was sure that would hold up in audit. She hesitated and put the breach language back in. She didn't know that single click in our document system recorded her user ID as the last editor to approve that section. She'd signed off on the cause for termination. Procurement kept calling meetings to discuss mitigating risk with the vendor. They wanted a cheaper deal, not a lawsuit. They kept telling Julia to hold off sending the letter. But she'd already approved it. I sat in those calls, muted my camera off. They thought I'd checked out. Really, I was making sure they committed themselves. Because they didn't understand how version control worked. You can rewrite the top layer. You can even lock the final document. But you can't erase the trail of edits underneath. They sent me one last Slack message asking for my feedback. I didn't answer immediately. I waited an hour. Then I wrote, "Looks good. Julia's sign-off should cover compliance." I watched the little green check appear next to my name. Because approvals in Slack are discoverable, Julia asked to talk privately after that. Her voice was tight. "Evan, I don't know if this is right. Procurement doesn't want to terminate. They're negotiating discounts." I just looked at her. "You approved the breach documentation." She swallowed. "I know. You did your job. That's all anyone can ask." She nodded, but didn't look reassured. I didn't comfort her, because she wasn't my student anymore. She was my insurance. Procurement's last-minute changes came in late Friday night. They wanted to remove the termination clause completely. Julia hesitated to make the edit. But she did it. The system logged it. So now there were 2 versions in the archive, one that invoked cause, one that didn't. Both with her name, both tied to my Slack approvals, both time-stamped. That matters in compliance, because you can't pretend you didn't see it. They were so proud of how they pushed me out of the process. They never noticed I was controlling it the whole time, because the last step in any compliance trap isn't writing the policy. It's making sure someone else signs it. Julia was scared. Procurement was desperate. Leadership was blind. And I sat there the entire week handing them the rope. They thought they had everything in place. They never noticed the fuse was lit. They made it feel routine. That was the clever part. HR didn't send a formal termination notice. They just booked me for a strategy alignment meeting at 4 p.m. on a Friday. The subject line was friendly. Catch up before client pitch. I knew what it was, because earlier that day I got the final email from Julia. Please confirm final approval on the vendor termination file. She was careful with her wording. She didn't want procurement to see her worry. But I knew she was scared. I replied immediately. Approved. Vendor breach language intact. I watched the read receipt come in. She couldn't claim she hadn't seen it. She couldn't say she hadn't agreed. Her name was baked into every approval log, every edit history. Procurement was still trying to stall. They wanted one more round of negotiation. They sent Slack messages about pausing communication with the vendor. I let them, because pausing wasn't deleting. The audit trail was already there. They could refuse to send the termination letter, but they couldn't pretend it hadn't been written. HR pinged me with a reminder for the 4 p.m. meeting. Looking forward to discussing your role going forward. Polite language is the best disguise for a loaded gun. Julia avoided me all day. She left comments in the shared doc instead of talking in person. Her last comment was just 2 words. Confirmed edits. I didn't respond because there was nothing left to say. By lunchtime, procurement had stopped asking questions. They'd seen the version history. They knew they couldn't blame me for it anymore, but they didn't want to admit it. So they went quiet. That's how betrayal works in corporate settings. Not with yelling or confrontation, just with silence and scheduling. HR's final move was so transparent I almost laughed. They updated my calendar invite to include the director, just to make sure we're all aligned. That was their legal cover. 2 witnesses. Documented discussion. They wouldn't call it firing. They'd call it realignment, opportunity to transition, whatever phrase their lawyers had approved. But the vendor termination file didn't care about their phrasing. It was locked. Julia's sign-offs, procurement's suggested edits, my Slack approvals, version control, system logs, immutable. They could delete the final document if they wanted, but they couldn't delete the history. That's the thing about compliance. It's patient. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs a record. At 3:45 p.m., I closed my laptop and gathered my notes, not because I needed them, because I wanted them to see I was prepared. I walked to the meeting room early. Julia passed me in the hall. She didn't meet my eyes. Procurement was nowhere to be seen. HR was waiting with coffee cups already on the table. The director smiled like he was welcoming me to a vacation briefing. They thanked me for my hard work on the vendor file. They said, "We just want to make sure you're set up for success going forward." I nodded, because what was I going to say? They'd already signed everything, already logged their edits, already approved the language. I wasn't fighting them anymore. I was letting them finish the paperwork. They thought they had everything in place. They never noticed the fuse was lit. They scheduled it in one of the big glass conference rooms. 12 people from the vendor side. Everyone wearing press suits, styluses, tapping on tablets, politely pretending they weren't here to measure us like livestock before a purchase. Julia sat at the far end, notebook open, eyes fixed on the agenda she'd helped me build. Procurement hadn't even shown up. HR sat in the back corner, pretending to be support. But I knew why they were there. They wanted witnesses. Vendor executives were making small talk about integration timelines and contract renewal windows. I stayed quiet, pulling up the final presentation deck. My heart wasn't racing. Not anymore. Because I had already accepted what was about to happen. I didn't plan on giving them a show. No dramatic protest. No shouting. Just the work. Because that's what they wanted to claim as theirs. My strategy. My relationship with the vendor. My reputation they thought they could co-opt. I greeted the vendor CFO by name, thanked everyone for their time, clicked into the first slide. Today we'll be walking through the projected savings in SLA compliance management, I said, voice steady. Not a tremor. I'd practiced this hundreds of times. Across the table, the vendor execs leaned forward. They had no idea what was coming. I started explaining the contract restructuring proposal, how we'd phase vendor onboarding, how the non-compete clause in our policy would give them single provider advantages for negotiation. I saw Julia watching me carefully, as if she half expected me to break. Instead, I just kept going, because that was the trap. HR didn't want me to melt down. They wanted me to look unstable. They wanted the vendor to see me as unreliable. They wanted to sever the relationship while making it seem like my fault. And so, while I was mid-sentence, the notification popped up on my tablet screen. Employment terminated. Effective immediately. Please exit all systems post-pitch. 6 words that were supposed to end me. I paused. For less than a second, enough for my eyes to flick to Julia. She looked pale. She hadn't known exactly when they'd do it. She'd agreed to help them, sure, but this was brutal even for her. I looked at the vendor table. They hadn't seen the message. They were still watching me expectantly, waiting for the next slide, waiting for the next promise. I breathed once and kept talking. As you can see on this timeline, I continued voice perfectly. Even the phased onboarding reduces risk by 28% in the first 2 quarters. Not a single crack in my tone. The vendor CFO nodded. The procurement director took notes. HR shifted in their chair, because this wasn't what they'd planned. They thought firing me mid-presentation would rattle me, humiliate me, make me storm out. They thought I'd prove them right in front of the client. That I'd melt down. That I'd swear. That I'd quit the room in anger. Instead, I gave them nothing. Just my strategy. My calm. My professionalism. Because that was the only thing I had left to wield like a blade. I closed the final slide. Looked at the vendor team. "Thank you for your time," I said. They nodded. Murmured thanks. Julia tried to catch my eye as I gathered my notes. But I didn't look at her. I didn't look at HR. I walked out with my head up. Because if they wanted to kill my reputation, they should have done it somewhere private. They did it in front of the people who trusted me most. The vendor execs who just watched me maintain total composure. Who would be wondering? If your company treats your lead strategist like that, how will you treat us? They killed their credibility in the time it took me to finish 1 sentence. I didn't go back to my desk. Didn't say goodbye. I just walked straight out of the glass-walled conference room, through the hushed lobby, past the silent receptionist, who didn't dare meet my eyes. My phone buzzed before I even hit the elevator. Slack notifications piling up. A thread titled Urgent Vendor Follow-Up. I didn't open it. They could scramble all they wanted. Nothing would change the fact they'd just stage my execution in front of the client. When the elevator doors closed, I let myself breathe. Not relief, just acceptance. The moment I'd been preparing for had finally arrived. HR's formal exit email landed 5 minutes later. Your role has been concluded effective immediately. Please coordinate with IT for system handoff. They didn't even try to phrase it as a layoff or reorganization anymore. They didn't need to. They'd done their damage in front of witnesses, but they hadn't read the policy they themselves enforced. Our vendor contracts included audit clauses. If a client relationship manager left the company mid-engagement without documented transition, it triggered a compliance review. They were supposed to schedule a handoff, a client briefing, a formal introduction to my replacement. Instead, they sent me an email, a single paragraph. Julia's message came in seconds later. "Evan, I'm sorry." 2 words. That was all she could manage. I didn't reply, because she knew. She'd approved every vendor termination clause I'd drafted. She'd signed off on the breach language. She'd let procurement push for discounts while ignoring compliance, and she'd watch them fire me mid-sentence. Now she wanted absolution. I let the screen go dark. Procurement called my cell twice. I didn't answer. They must have realized it, that without me, they didn't have a single signed-off transition plan for the vendor. No meeting notes. No replacement brief. They had a contract termination letter Julia herself had approved, saved in version history, and a client who'd just watched them humiliate their lead strategist. HR's email included a line about my non-compete. Please remember that per Section 4.7 of your employment agreement, you are restricted from engaging with competing firms for 12 months. I almost laughed, because they never read their own exceptions. Section 4.7b. No restriction on non-compete if employment is terminated without cause mid-client engagement, or if company fails to provide contractual transition. I'd helped draft that clause years ago. It was there to protect the company from compliance risk. They'd just given me the key to walk right through it. And they didn't even realize it. I scrolled through my inbox one last time before logging out. Vendor emails waiting. The client's project manager had replied to my last note. "Thanks for this. Evan, let's touch base next week about next steps." They hadn't even been told yet. I closed the email. I wasn't going to tell them today. I wasn't going to make any announcements, because I didn't need to. I just had to let Riven's leadership keep lying. Let them tell the client I was gone. No plan. No replacement. No handoff. I could imagine the vendor CFO's face, watching me finish the presentation. Watching HR sit in the corner, silent, then realizing hours later I'd been fired mid-meeting. What would they think about that? What would they assume about a partner who treats people that way? And I waited outside the building for my ride. Cold wind blowing off the river. I checked my watch. Less than an hour since they had hit send on my termination. Already the cracks were forming. I felt no joy. Just clarity. They thought the email ended the story. It was just the opening sentence. 2 days passed before the first formal crack appeared. An email from the vendor's director of operations, politely but unmistakably freezing the entire integration plan. Due to internal considerations, we will be pausing all scheduled meetings and implementation work streams until further notice. Short, professional, damning. I wasn't copied on it, obviously, but my phone buzzed with a message from a former colleague who still had access. "Have you seen this?" They pasted the email body. No mention of me. No drama. Just a full stop. Inside, Rive and I knew exactly what would be happening. Procurement was panicking. They'd counted on momentum, on scheduled demos, on the illusion of control. Without meetings, there was no relationship. Without relationship, there was no contract. Slack threads would be erupting with people tagging Julia, asking what the plan was. Who was the new lead? How would they reassure the vendor? Julia would be reading every message, watching the wheels come off. I imagined her replying with her usual carefully composed lines. "We're assessing options. Let's align on talking points." But there were no talking points. They had no approved transition. No new relationship manager briefed. No formal apology ready. Just the audit trail of them firing me mid-pitch. That was the real problem. Because compliance doesn't care about intentions. It cares about documentation. And the documentation was ugly. Their HR department's official termination note had already triggered a mandatory internal review. That review would force them to show the vendor all transition planning emails, the ones that didn't exist. Or worse, the ones showing they planned my exit while still using my work. Breach language in the contract. Penalties for failing to provide a named relationship manager. Audit clauses that guaranteed the vendor could demand their entire investment back if Riven couldn't prove it had met service obligations. They'd gambled they could replace me before the vendor noticed. But the vendor noticed immediately. They saw the Slack notification. They saw Julia's unreadable expression. They heard my voice stay perfectly even. And they read between every line of that forced professionalism. They were smart people. They understood what betrayal looks like. I didn't sabotage them. I didn't contact the vendor after I left. Didn't leak anything. Didn't encourage anyone to switch. I didn't have to. I just walked out and let the silence do the work. Because trust doesn't collapse with shouting. It dies in the hush after someone's been humiliated. Procurement started emailing HR. Furious, panicked, demanding urgent clarification on risk exposure and updated talking points to reassure the client. HR replied with HR language. Let's align offline. We'll circle back once leadership is looped in. Empty words. They couldn't fix it. Because the problem wasn't my departure. It was the choice they made to remove me publicly. They thought they were sending a message of control. What they actually showed was they had no plan. Julia's Slack status went from green to away, and stayed that way. She wasn't quitting, yet, but she was watching the fallout, watching the procurement team blame her, watching HR scramble to blame poor transition documentation. And she knew. She'd been part of every sign-off. She'd initialed every clause. I imagined her reading the vendor's email, freezing all meetings, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could she even say? Sorry, we fired your contact mid-presentation. Sorry, we didn't bother naming a replacement. Sorry, we treated your partnership like a formality. There was nothing. I wasn't happy about it. Not really. But I wasn't sad either. Because none of this was a surprise. They'd written the ending themselves the moment they decided my reputation was expendable. They never understood that a contract isn't enforced by signatures alone. It's enforced by trust. And once you burn that, no clause can save you. This was never about revenge. It was about clarity. A week later, the vendor sent the email Riven had been dreading. They were suspending all contract negotiations, effective immediately. No new meetings. No continued integration planning. No budget approvals. The wording was polite, corporate, but everyone knew what it meant. They were pulling back, signaling they no longer trusted Riven to deliver. I didn't see the email firsthand, but I didn't have to. Someone forwarded me the procurement Slack thread. Julia was tagged half a dozen times. Her silence was its own answer. Procurement was frantic. They started offering discounts no one had asked for. Maybe we can sweeten the deal. Let's show them we're serious about winning them back. Desperation in every line. But money wasn't the problem. It never was. Trust was. You can't rebate away humiliation. You can't discount over betrayal. HR tried to intervene. They suggested a sincere apology call. Show accountability. Rebuild the partnership. But there was nothing left to rebuild. They didn't get it, because they'd never built it in the first place. The relationship wasn't a spreadsheet. It was all the late-night calls I'd taken, the custom solutions I'd tailored, the way I'd navigated their internal politics so they wouldn't have to. All of that burned away in one meeting. And everyone at Riven watched it happen in real time. Julia had approved the policy language that let them do it. She'd signed off on the vendor termination file. She'd sat in that room. She'd watched me finish my sentence. She'd seen the vendor execs' faces. Now she was reading every panicked Slack ping. I wondered what she felt. Embarrassment, guilt, resentment, or just cold calculation about her own exit strategy. I didn't hate her. She was young, ambitious. She thought aligning with leadership would protect her. She didn't see they'd hang her out to dry the moment it went bad. Procurement's emails started referencing the audit clause. Worried language. Need clarity on potential breach penalties. They finally noticed the lines I'd helped write into every contract. The ones that forced a vendor audit if trust was violated. The ones that required proof of transition planning. The ones that spelled out financial penalties if a relationship manager was removed without cause mid-engagement. HR tried to spin it. We'll say there was cause, but there wasn't. No documentation, no performance review, just a single Slack notification firing me mid-sentence. That was the entire paper trail. Julia was copied on every message. Watching it unravel, I wondered if she remembered the conversation we'd had months earlier. Me insisting we needed better succession planning. That every client should have a named secondary contact. That it was a compliance risk not to. She'd brushed it off. Too much work. We'll handle it if it comes up. Well, it came up, and now Riven was hemorrhaging credibility. They were offering the vendor anything they wanted to stay. Discounts, extended payment terms, custom features. But the vendor wasn't replying, because this wasn't about price. It was about respect. And once you show a partner, you'll sacrifice their interests for internal politics they don't forget. Yet I watched it all from a distance, not gleeful, not gloating, just clinical, because I'd known, long before they fired me. I'd known they'd never value what I built. So I started planning, started documenting my work, backing up the frameworks I'd designed, carefully legally, so that if the day came when they decided I was disposable, I'd have options. That wasn't sabotage. It was self-preservation. A company's loyalty ends the moment you're inconvenient. Anyone who forgets that is a fool. They called what I did betrayal, but they betrayed me first. They taught me to see it coming, and they gave me time to prepare. They thought firing me would silence me. All it did was give me permission to speak. 6 months later, the vendor formally terminated their contract with Riven. Not a pause, not a renegotiation, a clean final severance. The language was as polite as it was lethal. We appreciate your efforts, but we'll be pursuing alternative partnerships better aligned with our needs. That single sentence cost Riven millions in projected revenue. More than that, it cost them something they couldn't discount or rebate credibility. Procurement scrambled. They flooded the vendor with last-ditch offers. Free extensions, deep discounts, promises of strategic partnership and custom service levels. All ignored. Because the vendor wasn't negotiating anymore. They were done. Riven's leadership convened a board-level crisis meeting. The audit trail they were forced to share didn't help. A complete record of them removing their lead relationship manager mid-engagement with no transition plan. No replacement documentation. No formal apology. Just a single Slack notification. The board demanded explanations. Procurement blamed HR. HR blamed poor communication from the strategy team. The strategy team pointed back at procurement. It was like watching professionals try to hold onto a rope that had already snapped. Julia resigned 2 weeks after the vendor's termination email. No announcement, no farewell post, just a sudden deactivation of her Slack account and a brief HR notice. Julia Smith has chosen to pursue other opportunities. I heard about it from a friend still inside. They said she packed up her desk without saying much, didn't take the company-branded notebooks or the cheap acrylic award for Employee of the Quarter she'd won last year. Just her personal laptop and a reusable coffee mug. I didn't gloat when I heard. I didn't feel satisfaction, just inevitability, because she'd made her choices. She'd approved the vendor termination file that set this all in motion. She'd let herself be the one they could blame when it failed. HR issued new policies after the meltdown. Mandatory transition plans. Formal succession documentation. They even updated the non-compete clause language to close the loophole I'd used. A classic move fixed the fence after the horse is gone, but no policy could restore the vendor's trust, or the industry's perception. Riven's reputation had been built on being the safe choice, the reliable partner. Now every competitor had a story to whisper to prospects. Did you hear what they did to their client lead? Fired him in front of the customer. Yeah, lost the contract over it. Even the details didn't matter anymore. Perception was set. Meanwhile, I had options, more than I'd expected. Word traveled. Other vendors reached out quietly, not offering jobs, offering partnerships, because they understood what I'd done wasn't sabotage. It was planning. It was making sure the work got done, even if the company didn't want to be the one to do it. I built a small consultancy, lean, focused, no hierarchy for the sake of hierarchy, no pretending that politics was strategy. Julia reached out once, a single line. Can we talk? I hesitated before replying. Eventually I said, sure, if you want to talk about real accountability. She didn't respond after that. And that was fine, because I wasn't interested in revenge. Not really. I wasn't out to destroy Riven. I'd spent years trying to improve them, trying to teach them that a relationship is built on trust, not contract language, that clients aren't numbers. They're people who notice everything you do, or fail to do. When they fired me mid-presentation, they thought they were asserting control, showing they were in charge. What they actually did was show the client exactly how little they value the partnership. It didn't matter what discounts they offered afterward, because trust doesn't get renegotiated. Once it's gone, it's gone. And for me, the non-compete clause they'd threatened me with, irrelevant, because I wasn't competing with them. I was building something they refused to be. A place where strategy was respected, where clients were heard, where no one had to fear being humiliated for the sake of office politics. That was my real victory. Not their downfall, but my freedom. And the knowledge that the next time someone tried to silence me, I didn't need to argue. I just needed to walk away and do the work somewhere else, somewhere better. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever watched your work devalued or seen someone punished for caring too much, I'd invite you to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because the truth is, these aren't rare stories. They're everywhere. They're just usually hidden behind polished mission statements and vague corporate jargon. But I think it's time we told them. All of them. Because the only way to fix this kind of culture is to expose it. And I don't plan on staying silent anymore.